Now that all of our to-do routes are set up and tested, in this final video, we're going to be exploring how to create a separate test database for our application. That means when we run the test suite, we're not going to be deleting all of the data inside of our to-do app database. We'll have a separate database alongside of test and to-do app that's used for the testing DB. Now, in order to set all that up, we need a way to differentiate between running our app locally and running our test suite locally, and that's exactly where we're going to start. This whole issue stems from the fact that in our Mongoose.js file, we either use the MongoDB URI environment variable or we use this string. This string is used for both testing and for development. Now, when I say testing, I mean when we run our test script. And when I say development, I mean when we run our app locally so we can use it inside of tools like Postman. What we really need is a way to set environment variables locally as well. So we always use the MongoDB URI variable and we never have a default string like the one we have here. Now, in order to get that done, we're going to look at an environment variable that's actually pretty special. It's process.env.node.env. And you don't have to write this code I'm writing on line 9. I'm going to be deleting it in just a moment. This node.env environment variable was made popular by the Express library, but it now has been adopted by pretty much any node hosting company. For example, Heroku sets this value equal to the string production by default. That means that we're going to have 3 environments total. We already have a production environment. This is what we call our app on Heroku. We're going to have a development environment when we run our app locally, and we'll have a test environment when we run our app through Mocha. This means we'll be able to set up a different value for MongoDB URI for all 3 of those, creating a separate test database. To kick things off, we're going to add some code in the server.js file up at the very top. We'll be moving this code out of server.js a little bit later, but for now, we're going to tack it on right here. Let's make a variable called env, and we're going to set it equal to process.env.node.env. Now, this variable currently is only set on Heroku. We don't have this environment variable set locally. Now, environment variables in general are used for much more than just Node. Your machine has probably close to 24 environment variables telling the computer all sorts of things, where certain programs exist, what versions of libraries you want to use, that sort of stuff. The node.env variable, however, is something that we're going to need to configure inside of our package.json file for our development and test environments. Then, just down below, we'll be able to add some if-else statements to configure our app depending on the environment. If we're in development, we'll use one database. If we're in test, we'll use a different one. Now, to kick things off inside of package.json, we are going to need to tweak the test script, setting the node.env environment variable. Now, you can set environment variables by chaining together multiple commands. The code we're about to write is going to have a fallback for Windows as well, so you can write the exact same line if you're on OS X, Linux, or Windows. This is going to work everywhere, including Heroku. The goal here is to just set node.env equal to test before we run the test suite. Now, in order to do that, we're going to start by using the export command. The export command, this is available in OS X and Linux. This is the way to get it done. Type this even if you're in Windows, because when you deploy to Heroku, you are going to be using Linux. We're going to export node.env, setting it equal to test. Now, if you're on Windows, this command is going to fail. Export is going to trigger an error, something along the lines of export command not found. For Windows users, we're going to add this OR block, where we will call set. Now, set is the same as export, only it's the Windows version of the command. Right after it, we'll be providing the exact same argument, node.env equals test. After the final test, we're going to add 2 ampersands to chain these commands together. So let's go ahead and break down exactly what's going to happen. If you're on Linux, you're going to run this command. This command is never going to run because the first one did. Then we're going to chain on a second command, running Mocha. If you're on Windows, this command is going to fail, which means you will run the second command. Either way, you get the node.env variable set. Then finally, you'll chain on a call to Mocha. With this in place, we now have a way to set our node.env variable right inside of package.json. This is a quick cross-OS update. As you can see here, we have a modified version of that test script. The original test script had a problem on the Windows side of things. It would set the environment variable equal to the string test with a space at the end, as opposed to just the string test. In order to properly set the env variable to just test and not test space, we're going to be wrapping the entire set argument inside of quotes, and we're escaping those quotes since we use quotes inside of our JSON file. This command is going to work on Linux, OS X, and Windows. All right, that's it. Now, I'm actually not going to add this for the start script. The start script, which is for the development environment, will just be the default. We'll have it set to production on Heroku. We'll have it set to test inside of our test script. And in the case of this script, we'll just default it inside of server.js because we tend to run this file without actually going through the start script. Right here in server.js, I'll set a default to development. If we're on production, this is going to be set. If we're on test, this is going to be set. If we're on development, this won't be set and development will be used, which means we are ready to add some if statements. If the env is development, we want to do something. The thing we want to do is set up the MongoDB URL. Else if the environment is the test environment. In that case, we also want to set up some custom database URL, and we would do that right in here. Now we can go ahead and actually set up our environment variables. We have two environment variables being used throughout the app, both of which are set on Heroku. So there's no reason to worry about that environment, the production environment. We have our port environment variable right here, and we have our MongoDB URI variable. Over inside of server.js, if we are in the development environment, I'm going to go ahead and set process.env.port equal to 3000. This means that we can actually remove the default right here. There's no need to have a default because port is already going to be set. It'll be set on Heroku for production. It'll be set locally for development, and right here we'll set it for our final environment, the test environment, setting it equal to 3000. The next thing we're going to do is set a MongoDB URI environment variable for development and test, which is the exact same name for the variable we have on production. I'm going to remove our default, taking the string and cutting it out so it's in my clipboard. Then I can remove all the excess code for setting that default. And what we're left with is just a reference to the environment variable. Over inside of server.js, we can now set that environment variable for both environments. Process.env.mongodb_URI. And we're going to set that equal to the string I just copied. Right here, we are using the to-do app database. Now down below, we can set process.env.mongodb_URI equal to the string we just copied, but instead of setting it equal to the to-do app database, we're going to set it equal to the to-do app test database. Now when we run our application in test mode, we're going to be using a completely different database, so it's not going to wipe the database that we're using for development. To test that everything is working as expected, right on the second line, all I'm going to do is log out the environment variable using console.log. I'm going to print the string env with a couple asterisks so it's easy to spot in the terminal output, and then I'll go ahead and pass the env variable in as the second argument. Now we can go ahead and test that everything is working as expected. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to start up our app using node server server.js. And what do we get? We get an env equal to development, which is exactly what we'd expect. And now we can play around with it in Postman. Over inside of Postman, I'm going to switch to my local environment. Then I'm going to go ahead and fetch all of my to-dos. And right here, you can see we have some leftover test data. What I want to do is go ahead and tweak this first one so it's different. Then we'll run our tests and make sure that the tweaked to-do still shows up. Because when we run the tests, we shouldn't be accessing the same database. So none of this data should get changed. I'm going to copy the ID for the first item, go into my patch call. I'm updating the text and the completed property, so that's good. I don't need to change that. I'm going to go ahead and swap out the ID, send off the call, and now we have the updated to-do with the text of updates from Postman. Next up, I'm going to go into the terminal, shut down node server, and run our tests using npm test. Now, when we do this, what do we get? We get our env variable set to test right here. Then it runs through the test suite. All of our tests pass, which is fantastic. The true test as to whether or not what we set up works is if we start up the server again and we try to fetch our data from the development database. Over inside of Postman, I'm going to make that get to-dos request one last time, and right here, our to-do data still shows up as expected. Even though the test suite did run, it didn't matter because it's not wiping this database anymore. It's now wiping a brand new database you can view in RoboMongo. If I click the connection and click refresh, we now have two to-do app databases. We have to-do app and we have to-do app test. This is fantastic. Everything is set up and we are ready to get rolling. Now, what I do want to do before we go is take all of this code out of server.js and move it somewhere else. It doesn't really belong here, and it only makes the server file more complex than it needs to be. In the server directory, I'm going to make a brand new folder called config. And in the config folder, I'll make a new file called config.js. And inside of here, we can do all of that process environment variable configuration. I'm going to copy all of the code and replace it to a require call to that file. It's a relative file, so we'll go to /config/config.js, leaving off the extension. Inside of config.js, we can now copy the code in and remove the line related to console.log. Let's wrap this video up by committing our changes and deploying to Heroku. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to clear the terminal output. Then we can go ahead and run git status to see what files we have changed, and we have quite a few. We also have some new files in the server directory. I'm going to use git add to add all of that to the next commit, and I'll use git status again to confirm everything looks good. Now we're ready for the commit, and I can go ahead and do that. Git commit with the M flag providing our message. Setup, separate, test, and development envs. And I'm also going to deploy it to Heroku so we can verify we haven't broken anything there. Git push Heroku master. Once this is done, we'll wrap the video up by heading into Postman and making a get to dos request to our Heroku application. We're compressing the app and launching it now. It looks like everything is good to go. Over inside of Postman, I'm going to switch environments from to-do app local to to-do app Heroku, and we can fire off this request. Now, right here, we get our two to-do items coming from the real database, which means nothing was broken on the Heroku application, and it shouldn't be. Technically, we haven't changed anything. In Heroku, all we're doing is we're running the config file, but we don't use the default because it's already set, and it's not going to pass any of these statements because the env variable is going to be equal to the string production. So as far as Heroku is concerned, nothing has changed. And it's showing that because the data is still coming back as expected. And that is it for this video, and that is it for this section. In this section, we learned about MongoDB, Mongoose, APIs, Postman, testing, routes, all sorts of great features. In the next section, we're going to wrap up the to-do application by adding authentication. That is all coming up next. I am super excited to get to it, so stay tuned. I will see you in the next section.